Yes, the zombies are back now and they're ready to test. They'll take that development code and tear it from your chest. Refactor your mind, take the test from red to green. All with an undead beam.
You're watching Rails testing for zombies, and this is level 4, where we're going to be talking about mocks and stubs. So you remember back with Rails for Zombies 2, we talked about a zombie having one weapon, or has one weapon. We're going to create a method in there called decapitate, which calls into that weapon, calls slice, sends the zombie to get its head sliced off, and then sets the status of the zombie to dead again. The test for this might look something like this, where we have decapitate should set status to dead again. We're calling the decapitate method and then asserting equal dead again to zombie status. Pretty straightforward. However, this test is not very good. Why is that? Because that slice method on weapon, well, that could be pretty complex. We don't know what's going on in there. It might have 10 steps in there that might fail, and then our test here fails when all it's trying to test is that the status is getting set. So we almost need a way here so that we can test just that status is getting set without having to change our source code, right? So take a look here. We have these two objects, right? So we have the decapitate method inside zombie that calls the slice method inside weapon, but we almost need a way to make it so that that slice method doesn't get run, or that it's sort of faked out in some way. We need to fake that call. In order to do that, we need to introduce a new external library called Mocha. Mocha is a library for mocking and stubbing. To include it in our application, we need to once again modify the gem file. Of course, don't forget, once you modify the gem file, you need to run bundle. Then we can start writing stubs and mocks. But what are stubs and mocks? Well, a stub is for replacing a method with code that returns a specified result. So sort of faking out a method. And mocks are basically a stub with an assertion hidden inside of it to make sure that the method actually gets called. These two concepts are really hard to understand, especially if you're hearing about them for the first time. So I'm going to try to repeat myself a couple times. If you have to watch the video a few times, don't be ashamed. Just do it. These are hard concepts to understand. So back over in our example, we need a way so that when our decapitate method gets called and it calls out to slice, we need a way to sort of fake out that method and have it just return nothing, have it return nil. To do that, all we need to do is call weapon.stub_slice. So we're stubbing out the slice method inside this instance of weapon. Okay, so let's move this back into our test. So here's our test method again. Decapitate should set status to dead again. We stub out the slice method for this test. We call the decapitate method, and we assert that the zombie status is dead again. So now our test is much better. We're faking out that slice method call. It's just returning nil. The status is getting set, and we're testing for it. That's great. But we almost need another test here for this method. Not only do we need to test that the status gets changed, but we also should test that that slice method itself gets called. Okay, so how would we do that? Well, here we are back over here. We need to stub out the slice method, but we also need to make sure it gets called. That's where a mock comes in. So here we're going to say zombie weapon expects slice. That's going to mock out the slice method, and it's also going to assert that the method itself gets called. When we move this back into our test, we call weapon.expects_slice, and then we call the decapitate method. Notice here we don't have an assert method, but we do have that little beaker there to show you that there's kind of an assert going on under the covers. It's checking to see that that slice method gets called, and if it doesn't get called, it's going to fail our test. Now let's take a look at another example where we might need a mock and a stub. So inside of our zombie class, we have a geolocate method. There we call an external service. We'll call it Zoogle. It has a graveyard locator. We send in the graveyard and we get back a latitude and longitude. So how might we test this? We might test that geolocate calls the Zoogle graveyard locator. All we want to do is test that the graveyard locator gets called. So we say Zoogle expects graveyard locator, then we invoke the method. We also might want to test that the proper parameter gets sent into this method, so we can say with zombie graveyard. This is going to stub the method and add an assertion to make sure that the graveyard locator method gets called with the correct parameters. Now let's mix it up a bit and make that geolocate method a little bit harder to test. This time, that external service is going to return a hash, which we're going to combine into a string. So if you take a look back at our test code down here, you're going to notice that our mock is going to need to return a value, otherwise it's going to error out, otherwise the method won't work. To do that, we simply need to chain another method and call returns and specify what hash we want it to return. With this, our test now pass. However, with the new complexity in our geolocate method, we now have two things we need to test. We need to test that the external service gets called, but we also need to test the proper latitude and longitude string gets put together. So how would we write that test? Well, we were using a mock before. Now we need a stub. We need to stub out that external method call and test that the proper string gets created. Let's try that. So here we have our stub, and then we'll say assert equal 2, 3 when we call geolocate. Before we go to the challenges, we're going to make it even more difficult to test. So let's revise geolocate one more time. This time, we're going to get back an object, a location object, and we're going to use that location object to create that string. You see we're calling loc.latitude and loc.longitude. So how might we test that? We're not just talking about a single hash anymore. It's almost like what we need to do is create an object that has a latitude method and a longitude method that just return numbers. To test this, we can use the stub command. With the stub command, we send in a hash. Each of those keys inside those hash are turned into methods which return the key value. So it's a lot like what you see above. We'll then make the graveyard locator method return that stub object, and then we just need to assert that the proper string is created. All right, that was a lot of information, mocks and stubs. It's not simple things, even for Zombie. So now it's time for you to get into the challenges and get your hands dirty with some mocks and stubs. Good luck.